8 years. And what do you have to show for it, man?
A photo album. He made a photo album.
This man flew in his own team. This man restructured 3 companies this year alone. That is what ambition looks like.
The man who actually showed up when this family needed him. A deal isn't done until it's signed.
Nobody asked you. Sit down or leave the table.
Maybe try the kids' table this time.
You don't belong here. You never did.
That night, my wife stood in front of 60 family members and erased me. She handed the microphone to another man and told me to find another seat, as if 8 years of marriage had been an inconvenience she was finally correcting. She was certain she had already won. I didn't argue. I simply watched because I already knew something none of them did. The resort we were standing in belonged to me. The company her family was counting on to survive, I built it. So what happens when the man you publicly threw away holds everything you're about to lose? If you're new here, this channel tells stories about people who got written off too soon and what happened next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this one goes. People in Madison had a way of sizing you up within the first 30 seconds of meeting you. The car you drove, the watch on your wrist, whether your handshake came with a business card or just a name. I never gave them much to work with. I drove a 7-year-old Volvo with a cracked dashboard I kept meaning to replace. I wore the same field watch I'd had since graduate school. When something broke around the house, a leaking pipe, a faulty circuit breaker, the garage door that rattled every winter, I fixed it myself, not because I couldn't afford a repairman, but because I genuinely preferred the silence of working with my hands. To the people who knew me through Serena, I was exactly what I looked like, a freelance supply chain risk analyst who worked from home, didn't attend charity galas, and couldn't hold a conversation about wine vintages. Forgettable in the best possible way. That was exactly the point. What almost no one knew, and what I had spent more than a decade carefully ensuring they wouldn't know, was that Aramont Global Holdings was mine. I had built it in my early 30s, starting with a single logistics fund and a thesis about how the world moved goods from one place to another and how poorly most of that infrastructure was actually managed. Within 6 years, Aramont had expanded into rail freight inland ports, cold chain storage, digital payments, cargo insurance, and data centers. The total asset base had crossed $1.1 trillion before I turned 40. The holding structure ran through a network of trusts, parent companies, and private vehicles that kept my name off every public-facing document. The financial press knew Aramont as a quiet giant run by a closed-door board. Nobody had confirmed who controlled it at the top, and I had worked deliberately to keep it that way. The reason wasn't paranoia. It was a lesson I had already paid for. Before I met Serena, I had been engaged to a woman named Rebecca. She was sharp and warm, and I had believed she loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with my balance sheet. I was wrong. Within weeks of discovering the scope of my family's financial structures through a document she was never supposed to see, Rebecca had begun photographing files, reaching out to a financial journalist, and quietly building what amounted to a legal strategy for gaining access to the trusts through marriage. I had ended the engagement and walked away without ever confronting her publicly. But I also understood clearly and permanently that anyone who wanted to be in my life had to know me first, the actual man, before they ever learned about the empire behind him. Before Serena and I married, I told her my family held significant investments and that I needed a prenuptial agreement. She signed it without hesitation, said she didn't care about any of that, and I believed her. For a long time, I was right to believe her. Those early years were easy in the way that mattered. We ate at neighborhood places that didn't take reservations. We took road trips in the old Volvo with a bad map app and no itinerary. She laughed at small things. When I came home late from work, she left food on the stove without making it a point of tension. There was a version of Serena from those years who seemed genuinely unbothered by the fact that I couldn't tell her about my real work, that our vacations were modest by her family's standards, that I deflected questions about money with the same quiet patience I brought to everything else. I don't know exactly when that version of her disappeared. I suspect it wasn't a single moment. It was a slow erosion that happened in parallel with something else entirely, the collapse of Wexler Foods and Supply. Howard Wexler had built the family business over 4 decades, and he had done it well for most of that time. The company ran cold storage facilities and distribution networks across the Midwest, serving grocery chains and institutional buyers, and at its height, it employed close to 4,000 people. The problem started when Howard decided that scale was the only way to compete in the next decade. He borrowed heavily hundreds of millions of dollars to build out automated warehouses, acquire smaller distributors, and modernize the entire logistics stack in a matter of a few years. The timing was brutal. Energy costs jumped. 2 of the company's largest contracts were canceled when clients were acquired by larger groups that had their own distribution arms. The warehouse management software failed its integration deadlines by almost a full year. By the time the debt service schedules began hitting, the company didn't have the cash flow to absorb the pressure. Wexler Foods was looking at potential insolvency within 6 months. I watched this happen from close range but said nothing. It wasn't my place. What I noticed more clearly was what the crisis did to Serena. She had joined the company's communications team 2 years into our marriage, mostly as a way to feel connected to her family's legacy. As the financial pressure mounted, she was given more responsibility and less support. She began attending meetings she wasn't prepared for, defending decisions she hadn't been consulted on, and managing a public face for a company that was quietly unraveling behind it. The stress was real, and I didn't dismiss it. But stress was not what changed her. What changed her was the moment she started measuring me against the crisis. I wasn't helping enough. I didn't have the right relationships. I had never done anything large enough to matter when it counted. She stopped saying these things in private and started implying them in front of others. At a dinner with her family the previous spring, Howard had made a comment about men who knew how to step up in difficult moments. Grant had looked directly at me and smiled. Serena had not corrected either of them. A few months later, at a company function where I had come at her request, she introduced me to 2 of the board's outside advisors and then moved away before either of them could engage me in conversation. She was editing me out of rooms I was technically still in. The morning I saw the Wexler Foods proposal in Oramont's internal review system was a Thursday in late October. I was going through the weekly deal pipeline on my laptop before Serena woke up. The file was flagged for preliminary review by the investment committee. A distressed asset situation, significant capital requirement, cold chain infrastructure with strategic overlap. The name at the top of the company summary stopped me completely. I read the entire document twice before I moved. Wexler Foods and Supply needed a minimum of $620 million to retire its debt obligations, stabilize operations, and sustain liquidity for 2 years. The situation was materially worse than anything Serena had shared with me. But the financing structure wasn't what concerned me most. What concerned me was the name attached to the intermediary role, Trevor Halstead. I had seen Trevor's name in deal circles before, a restructuring specialist with a strong network, expensive suits, and a presentation style that generated confidence faster than it generated results. His fee arrangement in the Wexler proposal was unusual. Beyond his advisory compensation, Trevor was requesting a personal equity stake in the restructured entity, a board seat, and the right to appoint a new chief executive. In a separate internal memorandum that had been forwarded alongside the main file, he had proposed that Serena be elevated to chief strategy officer once Howard stepped down from the chairmanship. The proposal made explicit that this outcome was contingent on the deal closing under his direction. I didn't move the file. I sat with it for a long time. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing things I had been choosing not to notice. Serena came home later than she used to, with explanations that were plausible but oddly specific in the way that rehearsed explanations often are. She changed the password on her phone on a Tuesday with no particular reason attached to it. She stopped wearing her wedding ring on trips she described as internal company travel. One evening, I found a hotel billing summary in a jacket she'd left on the kitchen chair, 2 rooms booked on the same night at a property in Chicago with only 1 room showing any charges for food or housekeeping. I didn't confront her. I filed it away and kept watching. I also requested that Oramont's legal and compliance team conduct a full audit of Trevor's conduct in the Wexler transaction. The early results were not subtle. Trevor had represented to the Wexler family and to several of the company's creditors that the Oromont investment was essentially guaranteed, while the deal had not yet been presented to anyone on the investment committee with approval authority. He had used Oromont's name, my company's name, to persuade banks to hold off on accelerating loan covenants, buying himself and the Wexler family time they hadn't earned through any legitimate agreement. If the deal ultimately failed, Wexler Foods would be exposed to potential regulatory scrutiny for having misrepresented the status of a major financing commitment to its lenders. I disclosed my relationship to Serena to the investment committee the same week the compliance report landed. I removed myself from any role in the initial valuation process and transferred full oversight of the due diligence to Elaine Kessler and an independent advisory group with no connection to me personally. I laid out 3 conditions before I left the room. No one was to give Wexler Foods favorable treatment because of my marriage. No one was to penalize the company because of what was happening inside that marriage. And every piece of misconduct tied to Trevor Halstead or the Wexler board had to be documented fully with nothing softened. The night before the family gathering at Silver Pine Lake Club, Serena told me what she expected from me at the event. I was to attend, say nothing about business, and stay away from Trevor because he had important conversations to manage with investors. I listened to all of it, then asked her directly whether she still wanted to continue our marriage. She didn't answer the question. She said she needed a husband who could help her move towards something, not a man who had always been comfortable standing still. I asked whether there was something between her and Trevor. She said no and looked slightly past my left shoulder when she said it. The compliance team's report arrived that same evening after she had gone to bed. It confirmed what the hotel receipt had already suggested. Serena and Trevor had been involved for several months, the overlap running directly through the period when she had been feeding him internal documents and financial projections without board authorization. I could have stayed home the next morning. There was nothing forcing me to walk into a room full of people who had spent the better part of a year treating me like a liability. But I had spent 8 years watching Serena and her family construct a version of me that fit their understanding of who I must be. I wanted to see it one more time, the complete unguarded version of it before everything changed. Not to expose them. Not yet. Simply to know with absolute clarity what I was actually walking away from. So I got dressed, got in the old Volvo, and drove to Silver Pine Lake Club. The resort my company had purchased 3 years earlier through a subsidiary whose name meant nothing to anyone in that family. I had never mentioned it to Serena. It had never seemed relevant. Until now. Silver Pine Lake Club looked exactly the way Howard Wexler wanted his world to look, manicured, expensive, and arranged to communicate that the people inside it had earned their place. The main entrance had been roped with white flowers. A valet line stretched along the circular drive, absorbing a procession of vehicles that cost more than most families' annual incomes. Guests moved through the foyer in evening wear, carrying the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having questioned whether you belonged somewhere. I parked the Volvo in the outer lot myself and carried in a small wooden box I had built in the garage over the previous 2 weekends. Inside it was a restored photo album, images I had sourced, printed, and manually arranged from a collection of old photographs showing Howard and Maribel in the earliest years of their marriage, decades before the company, before the debt, before any of this. Serena met me near the entrance. She looked at the box the way people look at something they've already decided to be disappointed by. She said I should have brought something appropriate to the occasion, something that reflected the significance of the evening. I didn't respond to that. I watched her straighten her shoulders and turn toward the room, and I followed her inside. Trevor arrived 20 minutes later, and the atmosphere shifted around him immediately. He moved through the foyer with the particular ease of someone who had rehearsed the role of important guest until it became second nature. He produced a bottle of aged Burgundy, the kind that required an explanation of its provenance, and announced with the timing of a man accustomed to rooms paying attention that he had arranged a private European itinerary for Howard and Maribel as a personal anniversary gift. A week in the south of France, all arranged. The room warmed to him in the way rooms do when someone enters already knowing how to own them. Howard embraced him. Maribel touched his arm. Grant clapped him on the shoulder like they'd been friends for years, though I was fairly certain they had met fewer than 5 times. I watched Trevor work the room and understood clearly what I was seeing. He wasn't celebrating the Wexler anniversary, he was investing in it. Every gesture, every anecdote, every mention of his recent work was positioned to build credibility with the people who would ultimately need to trust him with their company. He was particularly strategic about Oromont. In casual conversation with two of Howard's longtime associates, Trevor referenced the investment committee, the preliminary discussions, the alignment of interests, speaking with the precision of someone describing a relationship that was already settled rather than one that had not yet been approved by a single person with actual authority. I stood nearby and said nothing. There was nothing to gain from correcting him in that room in that moment in front of those specific people. Dinner seating made the evening's priorities clear without anyone having to announce them. The main table was arranged for Howard and Maribel at the center, flanked by Trevor, Serena, and the family members, whose status the Wexlers considered worth curating. I was placed at a secondary table with a small group of peripheral relatives, cousins from Howard's side, who hadn't been close to the family in years, a few guests whose connection to the evening I couldn't quite identify. When I asked Grant about the arrangement, he told me the main table was for people who were actively contributing to the company's future. He said it pleasantly, the way people deliver insults they've already justified to themselves. Through the dinner, Trevor held court. He described a meeting with senior figures at Oromont's investment division voices and positions. He named with confidence and suggested the $620 million commitment was essentially a formality at this stage. The family listened with the particular hunger of people who want very badly to believe something is true. At one point, I offered quietly from the secondary table that major transactions of that scale were typically not discussable until due diligence was fully concluded and formal approvals had been issued. Grant turned to look at me with the expression of a man who finds a minor irritation amusing. He asked what a freelance analyst would know about transactions of that scale. Howard told me not to disrupt the evening. Maribel made a comment about Serena's patience that she delivered to the table generally, but aimed at me specifically. A few of the cousins at my table glanced over and then looked away, which is what people do when they don't want to be associated with what's about to happen to someone else. After the dinner plates were cleared, Maribel invited Serena to the front of the room to speak. It was framed as a toast, a daughter honoring her parents' 40 years. Serena took the microphone and began well enough thanking Howard and Maribel for building something worth fighting for. Then she invited Trevor to stand beside her. The room adjusted, guests straightening glasses, lowering in response to the shift in register. Serena said Trevor had shown her what it looked like when someone chose to show up, chose to build, chose to act, rather than simply occupy space. She said she had spent years waiting for that kind of energy closer to home and had finally stopped waiting. She called me up to the front. I thought in the 2 seconds it took me to stand that she might be about to make some kind of formal statement about our marriage difficult, but at least honest. Instead, when I reached the edge of the raised area where she was standing, she asked me in front of everyone what I had contributed to this family in 8 years. The room was already tilted toward laughter before Grant answered for me, shouting that I had contributed a box of old photographs. The laughter came quickly, the way it does when a room has been waiting for permission. Serena said I had lived in a home she had chosen, attended events her family had paid for, and benefited from the Wexler name, while never once having the capacity to help them when something real was at stake. She said Trevor was what a man with genuine ambition looked like. Then she told me to return to the secondary table and stop pretending I belonged in the same conversation as the people in this room. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain myself. I took one step back from the front of the room and remained standing where I was. It was Nathan Corwin who changed everything. He was the general manager of Silver Pine Lake Club, and he entered through the side entrance of the main hall with 2 members of his senior staff at a pace that suggested something requiring immediate attention. He moved through the room directly toward me, not toward Howard, not toward Trevor, not toward the head table, and stopped in front of me with the posture of someone addressing his employer. He apologized. He said the property team had not been informed that the final owner of Silver Pine's holding structure would be attending the evening as a family guest, and that had he known, certain arrangements would have been made differently. He then asked in a voice that did not drop below the ambient volume of the room whether I wished to continue allowing the Wexler family to use the property for the evening or whether I would prefer the event to conclude. The room went quiet in the specific way that happens when a large number of people simultaneously recalibrate something they believed was settled. Trevor was the first to speak. He suggested Nathan had likely confused me with a lower-level representative of whatever entity had a minority stake in the property. Nathan clarified that Silver Pine Lake Club was held by a subsidiary of Aramont Global Holdings and that Malcolm Reeves held final controlling authority over that structure. He then asked with the same measured tone he had used throughout whether I wanted the Aramont Investment Committee's review of the Wexler Foods and Supply acquisition to continue. Howard said there had to be a mistake. Grant said I had clearly arranged the whole thing as a performance to embarrass the family. Trevor, to his credit, pivoted quickly, acknowledging the ownership without letting go of the framing, suggesting that whatever equity stake I held in the property was clearly peripheral to any decision-making at Aramont's level. He said it with enough confidence that 2 or 3 people in the room visibly relaxed. I declined to correct him publicly. I asked Nathan to allow the evening to continue and told him that any business matters would be addressed separately. Serena followed me into the hallway. She wanted an explanation, and she asked for it with the intensity of someone who had already decided what the explanation should be. I told her Aramont was a company I had founded before we met, that its asset structure had been fully disclosed in the prenuptial agreement under the relevant legal entities, and that nothing I had told her during our marriage had been a lie. I had simply not shared the scale of it. She moved through disbelief into anger faster than I expected. She said I had deceived her for 8 years. I acknowledged that keeping the scope of it from her had created a distance I hadn't fully accounted for. Then I asked whether the concern she was expressing was really about deception, given that she had just finished publicly describing me as a man with nothing to offer. She said she had been under pressure. I asked whether pressure had also driven her to maintain a months-long relationship with Trevor, while providing him with internal documents she had no board authorization to share. She said nothing for a moment. Her expression shifted into something I didn't quite recognize. Not guilt exactly, but the particular stillness of someone realizing that the ground they were standing on was no longer where they thought it was. Elaine Kessler arrived at Silver Pine with 3 members of Aramont's legal team within the hour. She had been monitoring Trevor's continued public statements about the deal's status, and the compliance team had flagged additional communications that required direct response. Nathan directed everyone into a private meeting room, and Trevor was informed that his presence was required. He walked in still carrying the posture of a man in control of the room, but that posture had begun to cost him visible effort. Elaine stated simply that he had never been recognized by Aramont as an exclusive intermediary in any capacity. She then presented the documentation the compliance team had assembled, emails in which Trevor had confirmed to creditors that Aramont's commitment was secured before any committee vote had taken place. His requests for personal equity and a board seat submitted through back channels. The Wexler internal documents that had been transferred to him without authorization. Recordings in which he had explicitly used Aramont's name to delay debt enforcement. The evidence of his relationship with Serena during the negotiation period. And the internal proposal in which he had outlined a plan to remove Howard from the chairmanship and position himself at the top of the restructured company with Serena beneath him in a role that would give him operational access. Trevor sat through the presentation without interrupting. When Elaine finished, he said he would need to consult his own legal counsel before responding to any of it, stood up and left the room. The door closed behind him with no particular emphasis, the exit of a man who had run out of moves and knew it. Howard absorbed the remaining information in the way that men absorb things that restructure everything they thought they understood about a situation they believed they controlled. Trevor had not come to rescue the Wexler family. He had identified a distressed asset, inserted himself into a position of trust, and used the people around him, including Serena, as instruments for gaining control of a company he intended to run. Serena's role in the plan had not been partnership. It had been access. Elaine delivered the practical consequence without softening it. Because of the misconduct now documented, Aramont was suspending the existing transaction in its entirety. The primary lender for Wexler Foods had already become aware of Trevor's misrepresentations and was preparing to accelerate its credit facilities if an alternative arrangement was not presented before Monday morning. Without a new financing structure in place within roughly 36 hours, Wexler Foods would not be able to meet payroll service its supplier agreements or maintain the cold chain operations that kept its distribution network functional. Nearly 4,000 jobs were at risk of disappearing before the following week was out. Howard looked diminished in a way I had never seen him look before. Grant shifted in his chair and said nothing, which was telling given how rarely Grant chose silence. Maribel, who had spent the better part of the evening suggesting her daughter had endured too much by remaining married to me, turned and asked me as Serena's husband to step in and make this right. Serena looked at me differently than she had looked at me in years. There was none of the contempt from the main hall, none of the performance. She said we could go home, that we could talk, that things could be repaired. I had watched her process over the course of about an hour, the full dimensions of what her choices had cost the affair, the documents, the alignment with a man who had been using her, and I understood that what she was expressing wasn't remorse. It was recalculation. She had just learned that the man she had publicly dismissed as inconsequential was one of the most financially powerful individuals in the country, and she was doing the math on what that meant for her. I reached into the document case I had brought from the car. My attorney had prepared the filing after the compliance report confirmed the affair. I set the papers on the table in front of her and told her that her not knowing I was wealthy wasn't what had broken the marriage. She had made every one of her choices while she believed I had nothing. That was the answer to any question she wanted to ask about why we were here. She looked at the papers and didn't touch them. Outside the meeting room, I could hear the gathering still moving through its final hour, the clinking of glasses, someone's distant laughter, the ordinary sounds of people who didn't yet know that the company underpinning their host family's entire identity was going to look completely different by Monday. I walked to the end of the hallway, pushed open the door to the back terrace, and went down the steps toward the water. The dock behind Silver Pine stretched about 30 feet over the water and ended in a small platform with 2 wooden benches that nobody was using. I walked to the end of it and stood there for a while, listening to the lake. The water was calm enough to reflect the lights from the main building, a long, broken shimmer that rearranged itself every time the surface moved. From this distance, the gathering sounded like nothing in particular. A low murmur, an occasional rise of voices, the kind of sound that could be a celebration or an argument depending on what you already knew. I had been standing there long enough for the cold to come through my jacket when I started being honest with myself about what I was actually weighing. It wasn't complicated once I stopped trying to make it complicated. On one side, nearly 4,000 people who had shown up to work every day for a company they hadn't built and couldn't control, who had made mortgages and car payments and school tuitions contingent on a paycheck that would stop existing if I chose to let the structure collapse. On the other side, the satisfaction of watching the people who had dismissed me spend Monday morning understanding what that had cost them. When I laid it out plainly, there was no real decision to make. The only question was, what kind of man I was going to be at the moment when it was entirely within my power to be a worse one. I thought about Trevor not with anger, but with something colder. Trevor had looked at a family in crisis and seen an asset to be positioned, relationships to be leveraged, and a woman to be used as a door. He had been willing to let Wexler Foods fail on his terms, restructured to his benefit with nearly 4,000 people as collateral in a transaction they knew nothing about. I had the ability to walk back into that building and do something that looked on the surface structurally similar. Use the company, its employees, its survival as a mechanism for punishing people who had hurt me. The difference between that version of me and Trevor wasn't as large as I wanted it to be, and I needed it to be larger. So I turned around and walked back up to the building. Elaine was still in the meeting room when I returned. Howard and Maribel were seated at the far end of the table. Grant had moved to a chair near the window and was looking at his phone in the way people do when they want to appear occupied. Serena was sitting with her arms folded, the divorce papers still untouched on the table in front of her. I told Elaine that Oromont would not be proceeding with the existing transaction structure. Then I told her what we would do instead. Oromont would extend an emergency capital facility sufficient to cover Wexler Foods' immediate payroll and supplier obligations, buying the company the time it needed for a proper restructuring without the pressure of a Monday morning default. The restructuring itself would convert Wexler Foods into an independently governed entity managed by a professional board with no family members in operational roles. Howard would step down from the chairmanship during a defined transition period. Grant would be placed on administrative suspension pending the results of the financial audit, which was not optional. Serena would resign from all positions with access to strategic data or internal communications effective immediately. Trevor Halstead would be formally removed from the transaction, and his complete file would be referred to the appropriate regulatory bodies for review of his conduct. The Wexler family would retain a minority equity stake in the restructured company on the condition that they cooperated fully with every phase of the process. Employee wages, retirement contributions, and benefits coverage would be treated as the first priority in the capital deployment sequence, not an afterthought. And once the company had stabilized, which would take time and was not guaranteed, a profit-sharing structure for frontline workers would be established as a permanent feature of the new governance framework. Howard objected. He said he hadn't spent 40 years building the company to hand it over to people who didn't carry his family's name. I told him the alternative was a bankruptcy filing before the week was out, at which point the question of who carried what name would become entirely academic. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he nodded once and said nothing more. The legal team worked through most of the night. By the time the framework agreement was initialed and the emergency facility was confirmed with the primary lender, it was past 3 in the morning. The guests had long gone. The main hall had been cleared, and the white flowers from the entrance were wilting in their arrangements. Nathan's staff moved quietly through the building, restoring it to the state it was meant to be in. I signed the documents that needed my signature, shook Elaine's hand, and drove home alone in the old Volvo with the radio off. The months that followed were unglamorous and necessary in equal measure. Oromont's restructuring team moved into the Wexler Foods operational infrastructure with the thoroughness that distressed assets require, renegotiating supplier contracts, stabilizing the cold chain management systems, replacing the warehouse software that had never performed to specification, and rebuilding the company's relationships with the regional grocery clients who had been considering moving their accounts elsewhere. The audit confirmed what the compliance team had already suspected. Grant had authorized the submission of financial reports that materially understated the company's loss position across 2 consecutive fiscal years. He had not invented numbers exactly, but he had made consistent choices about which numbers to emphasize and which to bury. He was terminated without the option of return, and while the findings were referred to the relevant authorities, the determination of whether his conduct crossed into criminal territory was not mine to make. Trevor's professional situation deteriorated faster than I had anticipated, and not because of anything Oromont did directly. The documentation that Elaine's team had compiled became part of regulatory filings that were by nature matters of record. Several of Trevor's existing clients terminated their engagements within weeks of those filings becoming accessible. His reputation in restructuring circles, which had been built on the perception that he delivered results through superior relationships, was fundamentally incompatible with the documented reality of how he actually operated. He faced a formal investigation into his conduct during the Wexler transaction. When the engagement collapsed along with any access to Oromont, his relationship with Serena ended with the same transactional efficiency with which it had begun. Serena signed the divorce papers 6 weeks after the night at Silver Pine. The settlement followed the prenuptial agreement in all the ways that mattered. Oromont and its associated trusts had been established and legally protected years before our marriage, and Serena had no claim on any of it. But I didn't pursue the outcome where she walked away with nothing. The house in Madison was hers. The shared financial accounts were divided without dispute. I instructed my attorneys not to seek damages or leverage her professional future in any negotiation. Whatever she chose to do next, I had no interest in being an obstacle to it. We met once more briefly in the offices of her attorney, a formality required by the process. She asked why I hadn't told her the truth earlier. I said that keeping the full scope of it from her had been a mistake I had made for reasons that felt self-protective at the time, and that I understood she had the right to feel misled about the life she had agreed to share with me. She acknowledged that quietly. Then she said the thing I hadn't expected her to say. She told me that what had been hardest to sit with, harder than any of the financial reality, harder than losing the position she had expected to hold in the restructured company, was understanding that I had been standing directly in front of her for 8 years, and she had only started seeing my value the moment she learned what I owned. She said she didn't know what that said about her. I told her I thought she already knew. I also told her I forgave her, and I meant it. Not as a performance. Not as a parting gesture designed to make myself feel magnanimous, but because carrying it forward would have required me to keep her at the center of my attention, and she had already taken up enough of it. A year after the night at Silver Pine, I returned to the property on a clear morning in early November. This time I arrived as what I actually was. The announcement that day was a formal one. Aramont was establishing an employee ownership program at Wexler Foods, structured to give qualifying long-term workers a meaningful equity stake in the company they had kept running through every phase of its mismanagement and near collapse. Several members of the property staff who had been working the anniversary dinner the previous year were still at Silver Pine, and a few of them recognized me. One of them, a woman who had been clearing the secondary tables when Grant made his joke about the photo album, caught my eye near the entrance and gave me a small nod that carried more in it than most formal acknowledgments I'd received that day. Nathan found me after the announcement concluded and walked with me for a few minutes along the path that ran beside the water. He asked why I hadn't said anything that first night, why I had let the evening go as far as it did before Nathan himself had intervened. I told him I had believed for a long time that silence was the most reliable way to understand what people were made of. If they didn't know what you had, they couldn't perform for it, and you could see them clearly. What I hadn't fully reckoned with was that silence had a cost I had been paying without tracking it in dignity, in the slow erosion of something I should have protected sooner. The lesson wasn't that I should have announced myself. It was that I should have been less willing to absorb treatment I would never have accepted from a stranger simply because the people delivering it were family. We walked back toward the main building. I passed the entrance to the hall where the anniversary dinner had taken place. The doors were open and the room was set up for a corporate event, round tables and a podium, and the particular neutral arrangement of a space that doesn't yet know what it's going to be used for. I stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. The room itself hadn't changed. The ceiling was the same, the floors were the same, the windows still looked out over the same stretch of lake. But I was not the same man who had stood at the front of it a year ago while 60 people laughed at a box he had built with his hands. The truth I kept coming back to was simple. The night at Silver Pine had never really been about money. It had been about what people believe when they look at you and how long you're willing to let a false belief define the space between you. Serena hadn't dismissed me because she didn't know I was wealthy. She had dismissed me because she had stopped believing I was worth her respect. The money, when it came to light, didn't change who I was. It only made it harder for her to pretend the dismissal had been reasonable. There is a question worth sitting with wherever you are right now. How do you treat the people you believe have nothing to offer you? Not how you treat people when you're being watched or when there's something to gain, but in the ordinary, unguarded moments when you assume no one of consequence is paying attention. Because the answer to that question says more about your character than any title, any salary, any seat at any table. The man who gets moved to the secondary table isn't always who you think he is. And even when he is exactly who he appears to be, even when he has no empire, no hidden assets, no twist waiting to unfold, he still deserves to be treated like someone whose presence in the room means something. That's a standard worth holding yourself to. Not because of what people might turn out to own, but because of what you turn out to be. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. We tell stories like this one every week, and there are more worth hearing.